Hey, hi, hello. I'm Jess, and welcome to Word Wonders. This is episode 3 Your Days Are Numbered. I'm sorry that it has taken me a while to post our next episode. I started back at school a couple weeks ago and I'm at a new school, so trying to adjust, get back into the routine. I'm going to try really hard to make sure that I am posting at least every other week, if not every week. My goal is every week. Okay, so like I said, today's episode is called Your Days Are Numbered. I decided to look into some idioms that had to do with numbers, because there are a lot, obviously. But before we get into that, I actually kind of went through a little dive into how did we come up with these numbers? Why did we choose these ones over other ones? And I don't have exact information, but I have some information. I actually found a little mini TED Talk type video, which was really interesting. So I'm gonna give you some of the highlights. Okay, back in Neanderthal time, caveman, they probably were counting things by using body parts or tallies, right? As civilization started to evolve and you needed higher numbers, there were new symbols created to represent higher numbers, and they were different in each civilization. Greek, Hebrew, and Egyptian were just extensions of tallies with new symbols for higher numbers. So you have all these tallies, and now you're going to get to what's called positional notation. So basically, this is where you're reusing numbers based on the sequence they were in. And this was independently created both in Babylonians, Chinese, and Aztecs. So all three of these civilizations kind of came up with this concept on their own and represented it a little bit differently. Number 0 was a breakthrough because what happened previously is that they would, if you're writing 308, they would do a 3 and then they would leave a space and then they would write an 8. And so sometimes that could get really confusing. I can imagine looking at some of my kids' handwriting and some of the spacing is off, and I think that would really mess up some stuff, right? So, and this number 0 was actually a Mayan creation, is what they said, as people started to travel and explore. So while digits were different regionally, what we know today evolved from a North African region that was going to be part of ancient Arab. And we have what you consider a base 10 system, I believe is what they describe it as. Why did they use base 10? Well, you got 10 fingers. Aztecs used base 20, so that's your fingers and your toes. There's also other bases, so some have talked about base 12, base 60, and then in technology you have base 2, and sometimes base, I think they said 6 and 8, but I'm not a technology person. That has to do with binary code, base 2. So the number 0, if you look up the origin for the word, it starts out Arabic to Old Spanish, and then to French and Italian, and that's where 0 comes from. So that Arabic region, Mayan region, I'm not told. So while I think the Mayans were the ones that came up with 0, how we pronounce it and what the number we evolved from is actually Arabic. Then you have the numbers 1 through 9, and they started from Germanic descent to Old English, and then they evolved from Dutch and German, and there are also a lot that relate to Latin and Greek, as do, I think, gosh, I really can't even imagine how many. I always feel whenever I'm searching up words or terminology or different things like that, I always see either Latin or Greek. But anyway, so that's where numbers come from. Hope that wasn't too boring. I am not a numbers person. I don't teach math. Math was my hardest subject. So if that didn't make sense, I'm so sorry. I don't teach math, and I'm sorry. I'll link the TED Talk video in the description because it was a cute little 5-minute video, and I think it was helpful. I decided to do 10. Number 1. For the number 1, I picked back to square 1. Back to square one means going back to the starting point. It illustrates the need to start again after a setback. The origin is uncertain, but there are 3 widely accepted suggestions. And I guess, the way that the website made it seem was that the people who believe one origin versus the other, like, they're like, nope, that has to be it. So apparently there's like some sort of fighting about back to square one. I don't know. But the first suggestion would be that it originated from radio broadcasts of soccer games in the UK in the 1920s and 30s. The pitch was divided into numbered squares to help listeners visualize the positions on the field. If the ball was passed back to the goalkeeper, it was said to be back to square one. I could see this being pretty plausible. I think that it's when I can't imagine listening to a game of any sort on the radio. I really need the visual, especially if it's a sport that I'm not super familiar with. I actually, in driver's ed, my driving instructor would listen to like sports stations, and like there'd be games on or whatever, and I was just like, I have no idea what's happening. I need that visual or I'm lost. So I could see that being pretty plausible. The second one has to do with the game Snakes and Ladders in 1952, or as you might know it now, Chutes and Ladders. Why they changed it, I don't know. But from the Economic Journal, they have this quote. It says, "He has the problem of maintaining the interest of the reader who is always being sent back to square one in a sort of intellectual game of snakes and ladders." I guess it would be, when you hit the snakes, you go back. But you don't always go back to the very beginning. So a lot of people are like, it can't be that because you don't go back to the very beginning. However, I could see it being that way for like when you have games where you have to go back to start. So like sorry or trouble, like that would be going back to square one, right? I could see that a little bit more maybe, but that's number 2. The third suggestion is that it comes from hopscotch. Certain moves would have you hopping right back to the beginning, aka the first square or square one. The game's name derives from Scotch, which was used from 17th century to denote a line scored on the ground. Number 2 is kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I like this saying. I feel like I hear it. I feel like it's used a lot in like the media, TV and stuff like that. So, and I actually kind of like what they believe to potentially be the origin of this. There's not a lot of proof to back this up, so this could be very wrong, but if it is true, I would be really interested in it. But basically, kill 2 birds with 1 stone is to solve 2 problems with 1 action. And they say that it was first used in 1656. The origin, they say, comes from Greek mythology, Daedalus and Icarus. A good story. I know that story. If you don't know that story, I highly recommend going and looking it up. But basically, you have Daedalus, who was the father, and Icarus was the son, and they were working on trying to escape the labyrinth on Crete by making wings and flying out. And so Daedalus, the father, killed 2 birds with 1 stone in order to get the feathers of the birds to make the wings. And that's where they hypothesize that the phrase comes from. If it's true, that's awesome. Again, I'm a huge Greek mythology nerd, so that would be really cool if that were the case. Number 3 is 3 sheets to the wind. I haven't heard this one used very often. I don't feel like it's as common anymore, but it's a good one. And 3 sheets to the wind, I may have to start using it more. Although hopefully I don't have to start using it more based on what it means. So to be 3 sheets to the wind is used to describe someone who is extremely intoxicated from alcohol. The literal meaning of 3 sheets to the wind stems from sailing terminology, where sheets refer to the ropes that control a ship's sails, not the sails themselves. If 3 sheets are loose in the wind, the ship would lurch about erratically. So, meaning that if, things came, like, you would be, like, I imagine, like, the ship, like, going kind of crazy, like, in the wind, right? This common idiom is, so obviously because it has to do with sailing terminology, it's nautical in origin. And it says it has sailed into everyday usage to depict a severe state of drunkenness. This phrase paints a vivid picture of someone being unsteady and out of control, kind of like a ship at sea. It's an old saying that refers to a person who is so drunk they can't walk or function properly. The phrase suggests a loss of control and stability, like a ship that's difficult to steer. These are fixed to the lower corners of sails to hold them in place. If 3 sheets are loose and blowing about in the wind, then the sails will flap and the boat will lurch about like a drunken sailor. So I had 2 different places that I looked into this, and so they kind of both said the same thing. And it makes sense. I feel like a lot of sayings tend to be nautical in origin, and I think that's just because I guess we still are, but like the exploring nature in people, I feel like, and back then when like exploring was obviously like this huge thing and very hard to do, you were sailing. Now, if you're doing exploring, it's a little bit easier to get around. Number 4 is 4 corners of the earth. I'm not going to lie, I feel like I should have picked a different one for 4. I don't remember what the other options were because there really wasn't a whole lot for 4 corners of the earth in terms of origin. The reason I picked it, though, is because it talks about earth being flat. So here's what it means. So 4 corners of the earth means all parts of the earth, meaning everything. In the King James Version of the Bible, it's also referenced in Revelations and Isaiah. And it does not imply that the earth is flat, even though some people would like to believe it is. But the 4 corners meaning the 4 compass points. So that's it for that one. That's literally all I have. But I don't know. When I saw like the earth is flat type of thing, it kind of made me laugh, and I thought you might enjoy it too. Number 5 is a bunch of fives. I have not heard this one before, and the reason that I chose it is when I started looking at what it meant, it reminded me of the book The Outsiders, because one of the high school classes I work with is about to start reading The Outsiders, and it kind of reminds me of like a term I feel like they would potentially use. So it's British slang term for fist, especially used for punching. I guess it appeared in print in 1925 in The English Spy, and it says, came up to the scratch and floored many a yokel with their bunch of fives. And then it also appears in Boxania. I believe it's pronounced Boxania in 1821, but that is unconfirmed. But that specific work is about boxing history and folklore, but I guess it's hard, like that piece of work is hard to find, and so it's unconfirmed as to whether it was mentioned there. However, a bunch of fives does certainly come from early boxing terminology. The scratch that was referred to in that phrase from the English Spy is a line that boxers were brought up to face each other at the start of a match. So if I read that again, came up to the scratch and floored many a yokel with a bunch of fives. So they came up to the scratch to meet each other and then punched each other out. And then in the early 1800s is when you saw the invention of boxing gloves, which later became mandatory under the Queensberry Rules of 1867. I guess because in the 1820s, bare knuckle fighting was still a commonplace, and the fives were the weapon of choice instead of using boxing gloves. And I guess we still kind of have a little bit of both, right? You still have like boxing and different things like that, but then you also have like MMA, wrestling, and so I still feel like a bunch of fives is the weapon of choice for a lot of people when doing that, like professionally, like sport wise, but also I think just in general people would choose it as a weapon of choice when in a fight. Number 6 actually includes 2 numbers, and so the phrase is at 6s and 7s. I've never heard this one before either. So it is meant to describe a state of confusion, disarray, disorder, or a situation marked by chaos or disagreement. If someone or something is at 6 and 7s, it means that they are in a state of uncertainty or indecision. The origin is said to have come from a 14th century dice game where throwing a 6 or a 7 was filled with risk and uncertainty for whatever the rules were. I'm unsure exactly what the rules were. It also appears in a work in 1374, and I guess the phrase was originally to set on 6 and 7, and now it's just at 6s and 7s. It also has a biblical relation in Job chapter 5 verse 19 of King James Version. It says, "He shall deliver thee in 6 troubles, ye in 7 there shall no evil touch thee." So that's interesting. I don't have a lot of information on Job. So I'm not sure exactly if it means the same thing here. Some synonyms are a state of confusion, in chaos, in a jumble. So that's at 6s and 7s. Number 7 is the 7-year itch. The 7-year itch is an idea in which romantic partners, especially married ones, who experience unhappiness after 7 years of being together. It is considered a myth, and the 7-year itch used to be a physical condition, and it was a rash caused by a bacterial infection known as scabies. Back then, scabies took up to 7 years to cure. The use of the phrase 7-year itch can also be traced to a play, 7-Year Itch, by George Axelrod in 1952. He borrowed it from the term used for the sickness to describe a person's tendency to cheat after 7 years of marriage, and even with a couple of kids. The play was turned into a movie, which became popular. Marilyn Monroe was in it. And so since then, the meaning of 7-year itch has changed drastically from that actual physical condition of scabies to then being this cheating after 7 years. And I would say the 7-year itch, I feel like the reason is, I feel like the people feel this way because once you're first newly dating or you're first married and you're so excited, you're super in that honeymoon phase as they call it, and then as life goes on, you kind of get set into your routines, and sometimes it can become dull if you're just doing the same thing over and over again, and so people want to fill their life with excitement, and so oftentimes people will search for things that they shouldn't. But yeah, so 7-year itch. Number 8 is behind the 8 ball, and it means to find yourself in a hard situation or a difficult position from which it is unlikely you can escape, or to likely be caught between a rock and a hard place. I also think that's another idiom in and of itself. So when you're behind the 8 ball, you're in a pickle, basically. Ooh, that's another good one. I should do one on food. Okay, I digress. Anyways, it originally, so this idiom comes from the world of pool or billiards. In certain variations of the game, getting stuck behind the 8 ball can mean your next shot is going to be tricky. And there was also a specific game of pool which was called 8 ball, and and the balls that you were shooting had to be potted in order. And so if your cue touched the 8 ball, you lost a turn, and if you potted it, you would lose the game. It was first printed in American newspapers in the 1920s, and it also has a spiritual meaning behind it as well. The 8 ball represents the idea of chance because it can refer to both good luck and bad luck. It is also associated with having a sense of balance, like the yin and yang. The 8 ball reminds people to take the good with the bad. The 8 ball is also a fortune-telling device that became popular in the 1940s, and it went from being a tool to a toy. I'm sure we've all seen the toy somewhere, especially if you've seen Toy Story, which if you haven't, you should. So that's where behind the 8 ball comes from. Number 9 is to the nines, and this means the action is done perfectly or to an extravagant extent. And the British English version of this is up to the nines. The phrase itself dates back to the 1700s. Language experts say that it came from Scotland. They speculate that it came from a game of 9-pin. So it was used in the sense that something made someone so happy it was to the nines. Beyond that example, no one is quite sure how the phrase originated, but there also has been guesses that it has French language influence, but that is just a guess and we're not really sure. In today's usage, to the nines is seen and read most often with the verb dressed. So if someone is dressed to the nines, he or she is dressed extravagantly or perfectly dressed for the occasion. One theory is that tailors were using 9 yards of material to make a suit. So that's where they thought dressed to the nines might come from. And then there also had talked about the 99th Lanarkshire Regiment of Foot, I think is how you would pronounce that, and that they had like exquisite uniforms, and so that's why it's called to the nines, because they were the 99th Regiment. There is an example used in a 1835 book called The Progressive Dictionary of the English Language. In his entry for the phrase to the nines, the example is used as dressed up to the nines and suggests that maybe perhaps it is derived from to thy nines, meaning to the eyes, which I guess kind of makes sense because if you're dressed to the nines, you're dressed really nicely, like the people who are seeing you with their eyes think that like that's an appealing way to dress. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about it, but there isn't really any evidence to back that up. It's also worth noting that the number 9 has been long used as a superlative. If you listen to episode 2, there was Cloud 9, which had a lot of interesting theories behind it. And then there are also the 9 worthies, which were characters drawn from the pagan and Jewish histories and from the Bible. And also classical mythology has given us the 9 muses of art and learning. So the number 9 seems to be like floating around there and used a lot in a variety of ways. And no one is quite sure why. It just seems to be, 9 seems to be the one that everyone lands on. So maybe that should be my favorite number. So instead of lucky number 7, maybe it should be lucky number 9, right? Last one is number 10. And now that I think of it, I should have done one with 0 because we talked about 0 to 9, not 1 to 10. Oh well. So I did number 10 and it's a short one and it's hang 10. I'm sure you've heard it at some point when you hang 10 has to do with surfing. So basically it means to be perfectly balanced on your surfboard so that the back of the board is covered by the wave. And doing so allows the rider to walk all the way to the front of the board and hang all 10 toes over the front of the board. There also is the hand gesture that goes along with hang 10. I actually always thought like hang 10 just meant like surfing in general or like to be loose. But there is like more specific meaning to it about being able to like hang your toes off the board. I've never been surfing. I imagine to hang 10 is probably really hard. If you surf, let me know if it's hard. But that's basically hang 10. There wasn't a whole lot for this one either. So there you have it. You now have 10 idioms and their meanings and origins. I hope that was enjoyable for you. I really enjoyed looking at, there was some really interesting ones in here that I had never heard of or like really interesting backgrounds. I will give you like a mini update on my reading. So I will tell you I have not read anything in A Day to Remember or A Teacher just because I have been preparing to go back to school. But I did tell you that one of the classes I'm in at the high school is reading The Outsiders, so I did start reading chapter 1 of The Outsiders. I actually did not read The Outsiders in high school, so I'm very excited to be able to read it with them. I will also have other ones that will come up because I am in a lot of English classes supporting, so I'll have a lot of reading that I'll do, so I will give you updates. So chapter 1 of The Outsiders is really all I've read since the last time I've talked to you guys. Also, next week, I'm going to do something a little bit different than looking at idioms. So tune in, let me know what you're thinking, if it is a hit or you think it was super duper boring, so that I know for later. As always, follow me on Instagram at Word Wonders Podcast, and tell your friends if they want to learn a little something new. That would be awesome. And I hope you have a fabulous week. Okay, guys. Bye, y'all.